Thank you. Thanks for coming out. I'll say what Henry VIII said to his fourth wife. I won't be keeping you long. That's awful. Well, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and how I got in this predicament of being the poster child for defiance of tyranny. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. My mom and dad, though conservative and in a sense God-fearing, but we weren't church-going. We had a memorized prayer we'd do at dinner. Sit thou with us, O silent guest, our friend unseen, who we love best, and by thy presence make us feel true happiness throughout this meal. Amen. That's all I ever knew. Never remember praying with my family other than that memorized prayer at dinner. I don't remember going to church. My parents were moral as much as I understood. I was an athlete, so I was disciplined, but I didn't know morality. Although I must say I was a moral pagan and an immoral Christian, and I'll explain momentarily. Some of you are like, ooh, this is going to get good. But I was raised in a home that loved America. People say a Christian nationalist, that they love their country more than the Lord. And I think, no, I love Jesus predominantly, but I also love my country. You can love two things at once. I do. I love my wife and I love Jesus. Go figure, two things at once. We're capable of that, and I do love my country. I was raised in a patriotic home. My father was a Navy captain, 2 tours of Vietnam. My mother was president of Republican Women, and my dad was president of the Chamber of Commerce and president of the Rotary. He ran for the city council twice. He was first loser. He got second in both cases. And I remember walking precincts. I met Ronald Reagan when I was 10. He had already been governor, and he had written a book called The Quotable Ronald Reagan. He was yet to run for president. My mother said he'll be president one day, and he rubbed my head and he signed his autograph, best wishes, Robert McCoy, Ronald Reagan. And what he didn't realize back then was that he was endorsing me today. So I gave that autograph to my son. And I was thinking about just growing up in a home like that. My parents were involved in the community. And then I became a Christian. I was a Christian in college, and I was led to the Lord and discipled by a cotton farmer in the San Joaquin Valley. Married, 3 kids, and he took me through the Navigator study, and I memorized scriptures. To this day, they're the scriptures I quote the most when I'm doing sermons, and he had taken the time over a year to pour into me and disciple me. And a remarkable wife. I remember thinking he's married well and his kids were precious. And I ended up, qualifying for nationals and breaking records, and then I became that Christian, and my college career concluded, and I went into industry, and now I had some money in my pocket, and I was a believer. And this is a part of the immoral Christian. I didn't have the discipline of athletics anymore, because I was in the water every morning at 5 a.m., finished at 7, come back at breakfast, go to class. Back in the water at 4, swim to 6, 7 to 10 on Saturday mornings, too exhausted to do anything bad on Sunday. Didn't have time to be bad. And then I had money in my pocket and time on my hands. And, I went to the college group and met a girl there, and we started getting involved, and it was inappropriate. If you need me to explain that, I can go a little deeper. We knew each other in the biblical ways. And I was convicted by it. I knew this was wrong. I'd come to understand the moral law. And you don't commit adultery. And, I wasn't given to her in marriage. And so I felt overwhelmed by it. And I told her at the July 4th July 4th picnic that we had to call it off. And so we broke up. And then a little short time after that, it was kind of a legalistic church. It was like, you've heard of Grace Community Church. This was Grace Community Church. Any church that has the word grace on the door doesn't have it in the building. That's my experience. I don't know if it's completely true. I've met women whose name is Joy and they don't possess it. I mean, it's yeah. Just the experience doesn't mean it's, so. I'm making friends tonight. So, and well, shortly after the July 4th breakup, she came to me and she said she was pregnant. That's a whole new ball game. So I went and told the senior pastor, and he said, well, you need to get married before she's showing. Yeah, that was great counsel. And I said, okay. I wanted to honor those in positions of authority over me. The hardest thing I had to do was go tell the man who had led me to the Lord and discipled me, college career pastor. We went up to Dinky Creek up in the Sierras where we would go trout fishing together, and I broke the news to him, and it was the most uncomfortable time. I mean, we basically finished our time together, got in the car, and it was silent on the drive back, and I felt as though I had just crushed a man who had poured his life into me. I just remember feeling so empty. Worst part is I had to go and tell my parents, and neither of them were believers. And my parents, I was born and raised in Coronado, California. They still had a place there, but my dad had taken a position as a senior executive vice president with Great American Savings Bank and taken over a series of banks to get them in order up in the Sacramento area. So they had a place up in Fair Oaks, and I drove from Fresno, actually Madera, up to Sacramento to meet with my parents during their cocktail hour. Every night they'd have a martini, vodka martini. And I went up there, and they wondered what I was doing there, and they sat down, and I said, well, I have something to share with you. And they said, what is that? My brother had just, I was the youngest of 4 children. My brother's 9 years older than me, my sister's 8 years, and the other's 7, and they're a planet, and I'm a moon that revolves around them. My oldest brother had just married a Guatemalan woman. He's 6'4", she was 5'2". My parents were prejudiced, and I was the last great white hope. So I sit down at their cocktail hour, and they say, what are you here? And I said, well, I've got some news to tell you. I said, my girlfriend's pregnant, we're getting married. And my mother, I kid you not, she screamed. Because the girl I was marrying was Hispanic. She said, oh my God. My dad, being a Navy captain, he has this way, he just shakes his head. He says, Louise, calm down. And he looked at me and he said, son, I'm sure you care about this woman, but you need not get married. And he was giving me the best advice, the best counsel he could, not knowing the Lord. He just said, this is going to set you back and set her back. He said, what you need to do, son, is just have her get an abortion, and you guys can keep dating, and you need not ruin everything by jumping into something so heavy like that. And I said, Dad, I can't do that. It's against what I believe. And my dad looks at me and he says, son, look where your beliefs have gotten you so far. Nothing like being spanked by a pagan, you know. And I said, Dad, that's not God's fault. That's my fault. I can't follow up one mistake with another one. It's a baby. I can't kill the baby. And I just finished Greg Kokel's class, and I understood how to defend the unborn, the SLED acronym, size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency. I mean, I was on fire because I was so into this. And every time he'd come up with an objection, I would refute it with the things that I had studied to prepare for. And he finally got frustrated. And he says, let me make it clear. Now, this is so not like my father. He was the funniest man I ever knew. Joyful, hilarious human being. But at that moment, he looks at me and he says, let me make this clear. You marry that woman and give birth to that child, you will never step foot in this house again. I was taken aback. Are you serious? And he's nodding. I look over at my mother, and she was, what's the French word? She was a biatch, a little bit. She's in heaven laughing now. She's a believer. She came to Christ. And she would agree with that statement, so don't all get all moral. I can't believe he called his mother a biatch. You never met her. I did. I lived with her. So just back up. So she's nodding, and my lip is quivering, my hands are shaking, my heart is racing. I was in my early 20s. And I realized at that moment, you're either going to do the right thing or you're going to capitulate. And yes, you got in this mess because of your actions, What are you going to do? And everybody's left with a challenge. We all went through that test with COVID. Some of us succeeded and some of us failed. And that day was the day I became a man. I looked at my dad and I said, Dad, and I looked at my mom, I said, Mom, I love you guys. I'm going to miss you. And I got up and I walked out. Well, they were true to their word. I became persona non grata. My siblings wouldn't communicate. I was cut off. And I went back and I didn't have a friend in the world. Legalistic church, I'm getting married, I've got the scarlet letter. And I take my fiance at the time, I asked her if, you wanted to go up to Hume Lake to listen to a Christian concert just to get away and kind of collect our thoughts. So we drive up the mountain to Hume Lake, we listen to the concert, which was terrible. And we turn around and we come back down, and as we're coming down the mountain, she asked me to pull the car over. So I pulled the car over. She wasn't feeling well, probably my driving, maybe morning sickness, I don't know. But she takes her engagement ring off and puts it on the dashboard. She says, I have to tell you something. I said, what? What? She said, I slept with Steve. Now, if you don't know who Steve is, he's the man who led me to the Lord, discipled me, college pastor, married with 3 kids. I just felt like my legs were cut out from underneath me. I said, well, I would have liked if you had told me that before I went and met with my parents. I said, we're not getting married. I'm not building a relationship on a lie, but I'll take care of our baby. I'll provide and protect that child. I was convinced it was mine, so was she. They'd only been together once. Well, that was in the early 80s, and you couldn't find out the paternity of the child until after it was born because you would endanger the child's life. So we had to wait through 9 months of pregnancy before the baby was born to find out that it was conclusively mine. And again, I didn't have a friend in the world. Now it was even worse because I'm being accused of destroying the pastor's life, and forget about getting married. I didn't have a friend in the world but Jesus. But I will say this. There was a young lady I had met a few years earlier that would call me every year on my birthday, and she was the only person I carried a picture of in my wallet. She had a laughter that would captivate you and paralyze you. She just had a smile that filled the room. And true to her nature, she reached out and tried to connect with me close to my birthday, and I got a message that she had, and I called her and I filled her in on the mess. I was thinking, well, she's not going to want to have anything to do with me, and even if she's somebody that I'd have the privilege to be with for my life, why would she want to? Because she'd be raising someone else's child. But the definition of a friend is when the whole world goes out, they come in. And that was Michelle. She was going to Cal Poly. She'd come to Christ. She'd come to Christ at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and if you want a really good Christian education, go to a public school. So many Christians have come out of there because they have such neat parachurch ministries, and Michelle, she got saved real good. And she stayed with me through that entire time, and then the baby was born, and we took the blood test, and it was his. I didn't believe it, he didn't believe it, she didn't believe it, his wife didn't believe it. So we took the blood test again, conclusively his. And so I took Michelle on a trip underneath a willow tree in some guy's property in Fresno, which it's not the prettiest place in the world. If California needed an enema, they'd put the tube in Fresno. Sorry, just trying to give you a visual. And underneath this willow tree in the beauty of the valley, I said, look, I don't know what you're doing for the next 60 or 70 years, but would you marry me? And she said yes. And I called my mother. My mother answered, why are you calling? Fulfilling that title. I said, I'm getting married. I thought you already were married. I go, no, it's a whole long story. Well, who are you marrying this time? This is, ooh. Honor your mother and father. It'll go well with you. You live long on the earth. I said, I'm marrying Michelle Colette. I'm marrying Meterise Coletti, but she goes by her middle name, Michelle. And the reason why she goes by Michelle is because nobody knows how to pronounce Meterise. It's actually French, Médéris. And my mother, I mean, I've told the story before. No one's ever heard the name Meterise. My mother goes, I know a Meterise. I'm like, you do? Yes, I know a Meterise Fowler. I go, well, that's Michelle's grandmother. She said, you're marrying Admiral Richard Fowler's granddaughter? I said, well, yes, I am. Richard Labatt Fowler was decorated with the Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. He sunk the Nagata, which was a command ship of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Highly decorated Navy ace, buried in Arlington. And I said, yes, I'm marrying his granddaughter. He died on active duty in 1967 while Michelle was in the womb of her mother. Never to meet such an amazing man, but she did know her grandmother. Her grandmother remarried another admiral after both of them became widows. My mother didn't like any of my siblings' spouses, but she adored Michelle. Who wouldn't? And my mother was just so blessed by Michelle. My mother came to Christ, and so did my dad. And I want to tell you what happened and how she came to Christ. When I walked out that day, my mother was confronted with having had 2 abortions in Japan when my father was stationed there. So convicted by it, she found Father Michael Murphy, an evangelical Catholic, confessed that. He led her to the Lord, and my dad came to Christ as well. My mother was an amazing Christian woman. That whole mantra of biatch just dissipated. She was a powerhouse of a woman. She had smoked like a chimney most of her life. She had a spot in her lung. And she was in her 80s, and she was so full of life, and we were convinced she'd live to be 100. My dad had Alzheimer's. He was in a home. And I remember my mother went in for surgery that was botched by a bad surgeon, and she's trying to recover from this brutal surgery. I walked into her hospital room, and I realized as I was walking in, her back was to me, and she was looking out the window, forlorn. She turned and she looked over her shoulder, and she saw me, and then she looked back out the window, and I went and sat in her peripheral vision to her right. And she was contemplative. She didn't look at me, but she said, Rob, have I made a mistake? I said, Mom, what do you mean? Because I really felt like I was coming in as her minister, not her son. I said, Mom, what do you mean? She says, having had the surgery so late in life, have I made a mistake? Now, I had never heard this term before. I don't know where it came from. I know what it is now. I've heard it since, but I hadn't heard it up to that point. But I uttered these words, and it was based out of James, and I've used this many times. If any man lacks wisdom, all he need to do is ask of God. God will give freely to him who asks. I was just saying, God, help me. I don't know what to say here. And I said, Mom, it's the economy of God's grace. And she goes, what do you mean? I have no idea. No, she says, what do you mean? I go, and again, God's just spoke impression to my heart. And I said, Mom, if the surgery's successful, you'll have more time with us. If it isn't, you'll get to see the finish line and finish well. Now, I don't know where that came from. And I thought, well, you are so wise, Lord. You know. And she settled and she said, yes. I said, Mom, what do you miss the most about Dad? As we were just thinking and talking of life. She said, oh, that's easy, son. I miss his humor. Funniest man I ever met. I have a video I could show you, but I didn't cue it up. I'll tell you about it later. And as we're just sitting there thinking of things like that, my mother says, Rob, there's something I have to tell you. I said, okay, Mom. She said, do you remember when you told me you were marrying Meterise Coletti, and I was so excited you were marrying the Admiral's granddaughter? I said, yes, Mom. She said, I also told you that Michelle's grandmother, who she's named after, by the way, Med Fowler, she said, Michelle's grandmother was at your baby shower when you were young. I said, really? She said, yes, she was best friends with your godmother, Lois Early. Lois Early was married to Rear Admiral Robert Broussard Early, and I'm named after him. I'm Robert McCoy, named after Robert Early, Rear Admiral Robert Early. Rear Admiral Robert Early and Rear Admiral Richard Labatt Fowler were classmates at the academy in 1937. Yeah. My godmother and her grandmother were best friends. They were both at my baby shower. And I said, yeah, Mom, I remember you telling me that. She said, I didn't tell you the whole story, son. I said, okay. She started crying. She said, Rob, your father didn't want to have any more children, and I didn't think I could. And when I found out I was pregnant with you and he was on a Westpac cruise, he had suggested you be aborted. Now, I didn't know where to obtain an abortion in '63 in California. I knew where to do it in Japan. So I went and inquired of the commanding officer's wife, which is what they did back then, Lois Early. Lois said, Louise, let me get back to you. And Lois Early was childless, and my mother assumed she was childless to further her husband's career. And she could confide in her, and she confided in Lois. And Lois said, I'll look into it and I'll get back to you. And without my mother's permission, she got together with her best friend, Med Fowler, Med Reese, and they put on a baby shower and saved my life. Michelle's grandmother bought my crib, and I got to marry her granddaughter. And that's because one day I walked out a door. You see, life matters. It gives everything substance. You get conviction to do the right thing, and you stand upon those principles, and one day you turn around and you've had the privilege of being married to the most amazing woman on the face of the earth when you almost screwed it all up. Standing for truth is worth it, always. I didn't know what would happen. I was lonely. I didn't want to live. I thought about suicide. Satan whispers to you in those times of trial. But all of that was preparation for even harder things. It gets harder, but you're equipped for those. And so when the pandemic came through, I knew what to do. I didn't care if they wanted to put me in jail. I'll conclude with this, and I'll answer questions with you. I went up to Northern California during this whole ordeal where they had put a restraining order on me, and they had gotten a politically predictive judge to agree to it and named me and 1,000 congregants or visitors that we would receive a citation, me particularly be arrested. And I was burdened over whether or not I'm supposed to violate a restraining order. And I have pastors calling me saying I'm in violation of Romans 13. And by the way, if you're one of those pastors and you think I'm in violation of Romans 13, read the passage again, because you're wrong. Jonathan Mayhew exegeted that text and transformed the Western world by giving the mantra that started the War of Independence. And it was John Adams who attributed it to him when he exegeted Romans 13, where it says, God appoints all positions of authority. We're to submit to that authority because they're there for our good. When they cease to do good, they cease to be the authority. And that's why in the Declaration of Independence, they say, not for light or transient causes. And they listed the reasons how that king had violated them all. And it was Jonathan Mayhew who coined the term, disobedience to tyrants is obedience to God. So you tell me I'm in violation of Romans 13? You are. They're enslaving and they're abusing your neighbors that you're supposed to love more than yourself. They're causing the elderly to die alone and you're saying nothing. They're quarantining the abused with the abuser, and you're saying nothing. They're mutilating children because they say that it's science, and you're saying nothing. Don't tell me I'm in violation of Romans 13. You're in violation of Romans 13. Stand upon truth. Do the right thing. Quit cowering behind the number one quoted verse in Nazi Germany. Out of context, by the way. It doesn't work that way. And so, When the governor said the church was non-essential and I'm facing a restraining order and the possibility of violating it, I tried to get away with my wife and family up in Northern California, up at a lake. I had the most excruciating pain in my shoulder. I've never had anything like it, and I've had back surgery. I couldn't sleep. You could see it on my face. It was awful. And I have to go back down, and I have to meet with the elders, and I'm contemplating whether or not I'm supposed to do this. I'm scared to death. And I called the attorney, and I said, tell me everything I'm going to lose if I violate this restraining order. He gave me a page and a half of consequences. You'll lose your house, you'll lose a church. He goes through the whole thing. Your son will lose a scholarship. And they went through the whole thing. And I'm writing it down. I said, is there anything else? He'd add one or two things. And then my chest is getting tight. And I go, let me call you right back. And I called Michelle, and I just said, this is what's going to happen if we violate. I'm not doing it without you. And Richard Wurmbrand's wife said this of him. She said, I'd rather be a widow than be married to a coward, dear. And that's basically what Michelle said to me. I'd rather be a widow than be married to a coward. And I'm like, I can do this with you. And I move forward. She's my best friend. My kids were thrilled because we were standing for their generation. My staff knew me, so they were all in. And we're like, let's go. The elders were the toughest part. I had 15 elders. It had to be a unanimous decision. And I sat them down and I told them I'm preparing to violate the restraining order. And it has to be a unanimous decision by the elders. And if it isn't tonight, there's a letter that I've placed in front of you. That's my letter of resignation. It's not a threat. It's not either or. I just can't live with myself if I have to capitulate to tyranny. And the vote was 15-0 to agree. Well, it was 14-0. One attorney abstained because he couldn't vote to break the law, and we needed him to defend us. And then I called the landlord who owned the building, and he was a West Texas man. I said, I have a fiduciary responsibility. They could take your building, and we're planning on violating a restraining order, and I just wanted to call and get your input. Rob, we gave that building to the Lord a long time ago. You go kick their ass. That's what he said, verbatim. And so I called the attorney and I said, I'm gonna break the law tomorrow. I know you can't counsel me to break the law, but will you defend me? And he said, yes. And I was in the airport, Sacramento airport. My son-in-law, Micah, was with me. Micah looks at me and goes, you all right? I go, yeah. He goes, you look good. Is your shoulder hurt? I go, it's gone. Immediately it was gone. I've never experienced anything like that. The enemy of your soul and the enemy of freedom wants to paralyze you with fear. It's the only thing he has. Do not capitulate. Do not comply. Stand for truth. Get a backbone and do the right thing. It's worth it. If God takes me right now, I am fulfilled. I've done right for the next generation. I have stood on their behalf. I have stood for life. I have honored my wife and my family. I'll go anywhere at any time with any amount of people, and I will create the model and evangelize it, and I will do it till my very last breath. And I have to tell you, that is the most fulfilling life anyone could ever ask for. Or do you want to just cower and be a slave to a tyrant when you can be a slave to righteousness and truth? And that's our calling. Choose this day whom you'll serve. Choose this day whom you'll serve. Will you cower in defending the truth because you're too afraid of the consequences of telling the truth? And the last thing is this. If you took the shot, did you take it because you believed in its efficacy? Or did you take it because you didn't want to lose your job? I'll leave it at that. You know that all of us have failed and fallen short. I have. I am. The Apostle Paul began his ministry by saying I'm a sinner, and he ended 2 Timothy by saying I'm the chief of sinners. You'd think he would have improved. I got you beat in the sin category. But I do know this, forget what is behind and strive for what is ahead and take hold of that for which Christ Jesus has taken hold of you. There's now therefore no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Forget that. You're a new creature in Christ. And today is the first day of the rest of your life. Do it right from here on out. You made a mistake, forget it. Let's move forward and do it right. Any questions, I guess? What are we doing, Sam? I'm just a trailer behind an RV. I go where I'm towed.
All right, so Jeremy will be standing up here. If you have questions for Rob, just start lining up behind Jeremy, and we'll get a chair for Rob here in a second, and then...
I'm okay. I don't need a chair.
Okay, well, we'll get it anyway, in case. All right, here, Jeremy.
Okay, thank you, Sam.
So it's questions, not statements. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, put a caboose on the end of it. Nobody. Can we just go home? This guy's irritating.
No questions?
Well, there was a question they asked Biden, boxers or briefs, and he said, depends. That's disrespectful. That's true. Any questions? All right, let's just do comments then. Who wants to be heard tonight? Nobody. All right. Oh, there you go. Bless you. First penguin off the iceberg. The first lemming off the cliff.
All right. Here's the hypothetical. Given how the political and emotional climate of the election of 2020, going into the election of 2024, what kind of obstacles do you think might be coming up for our nation, and how would you suggest preparing for those?
That is a great question. I mean, that's a tremendous question. I imagine that reflects the concern of everyone in this room. That's well said. Thank you. Okay, first of all, the higher the level of the election, the further away it is from the common man. So the greatest impact we can have right here, and by the way, we call Washington, D.C. the swamp, don't we? In Sacramento, we call it the swamp. And geographically, both D.C. and Sacramento are swamps. And figuratively and, geographically. And a swamp is where water reaches its lowest point. And it collects all the sediment and the pollution and ends up there. And it stinks. If you want to change the swamp, you need to change the source. So you go upstream, and that's why they say that all politics is local. So you have a greater chance of changing it locally. And you heard me say, create the model and evangelize it. So many folks said, oh, what they did in Pennsylvania and Georgia and Wisconsin and Michigan, and the election's not fair. They've been doing that in Florida with dimpled and hanging chads and all that. They turned it around in Virginia because they trained churches to do poll watching, and they were able to turn the tide in Virginia. They couldn't do it in New Jersey, even though they had a huge turnout. They were able to dicker with the election and hold it off. But in Virginia, they staved it off, and they had great success. So it's going to take a while to build up folks to do poll watching and hold them accountable. We're not going to be able to do it in Philadelphia. It's at this point. So there's a lot that happens. So what I would say is, do not despise a day of small beginnings. Develop the strength of local. And I was sharing with a couple of folks throughout the last 2 days, one of my favorite illustrations is a grandpa's walking with a grandson on the beach after a major hurricane. And the storm had subsided, and the sun was out, but there was millions of starfish that were washed up on the beach, and they were all dying in the sun, and the little grandson's throwing them back in the water. And the grandpa looks at him because he's been around a long time. He says, you can't make a difference. There's too many of them, grandson. And the grandson looks at him and says, but Grandpa, I'm making a difference for this one. And I'm making a difference for this one. And the grandpa begins to join him, and the output is exponential. But if they looked at the horizon, they would be discouraged. But if they looked in front of them, they're making a difference. Right now, you can make a complete difference in this community. Bam, just like that. If the church is unified, you could have godly representation in every office in your community. You'd be the keeper of the gate. And then it's the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, where now you are covering your city. If the governor comes down, the pushback comes from the council saying, we will not comply. The most powerful elected official in the county is the sheriff, and the sheriff will say, we don't comply, and you can come in and threaten us, but our officers are armed, and you stay out of our county because you are bound by the Constitution, as are we. And that's why you hold them accountable locally and train all of your folks. I would encourage you to turn off the television and quit getting discouraged at the national level and looking out at the horizon of all the things that plague you and paralyze you because the problems are too immense. Because folks think, and I said this earlier, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's true. It's like, how could we have lost the last election? I bought a pillow. And you see what they did there. Tucker's gone. I mean, they have power to pull things nationally. And they're seeking globalism. But how do you thwart that? You protect your community. You stave it off. Each cell becomes stronger and grows. We want a magic bullet. We want to start from the top down. But the Lord wants you to get involved in your community where you're going to make a difference. You're going to protect the children of your community. You'll be held accountable for what you're entrusted with, your circle of influence. So you're thinking 2024, we may face exactly the same thing where they're going to take the election. The opposition doesn't campaign. They're feverishly working to get the people who count the votes as opposed to campaigning. Evil doesn't sleep. And good people go to work every day and spend time with their families. Well, we have to realize our families are under attack. We're at war, so we have to make some sacrifices now. And part of that is shore up locally and do what you can locally and unify. And look, there's probably a host of different denominations that have different theological positions, but if we don't get this right, we're going to be arguing those from prison. We need to agree to move forward on basic principles and to stand on that. One thing we have to avoid is moral pietism. And this is one that gets me. It's 2 stories I'll share with you. And see, that's why no one asks questions, because I talk forever. The person next has to stand and be exhausted. Moral pietism, 2 stories. One in particular, I remember Mike Huckabee was introducing the candidate for President, Donald Trump, to a room full of pastors at one of our American Renewal projects. And Mike is a good friend, and he was struggling through introducing, a man who's been 3 times married, twice divorced, a womanizer, in New York. He was pro-choice most of his life, and everyone didn't know what to make of this guy. But Mike liked him because as they go from campaign to campaign with 17 Republican candidates, Trump would bring him on his plane. He was generous. And everyone liked him. Nobody liked Ted Cruz because he was kind of himself and didn't want anything to do with anybody else and was a little bit arrogant, many of them said, but Mike just really came to appreciate Trump. And Mike was at my 15th anniversary, and I said, Mike, you're introducing him wrong. He says, tell me, because I have no idea how to introduce a guy. I said, Samson. He goes, what? I go, think about Samson. Trump's been 3 times married, twice divorced. He's caustic in his emails. He's bombastic. He's got funky hair. He's completely egotistical. Yes. I go, he's basically immoral to the Christian community. Most of them, I can't vote for somebody who's been 3 times married, twice divorced. He goes, I know. I deal. I go, I know. Just tell them I agree with you. But you have to take Samson out of the hall of faith in Hebrews 11. Name one moral thing about Samson's life. He was in a prostitute's bed all night, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. I can't teach that in Sunday school. It's like, he went to go pay off a gambling debt, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. What's his downfall? Women and his iconic hair. Remind you of anybody? And at this point, Mike is laughing. And I go, we hear the 7 mountains of influence. And I'm not a dominionist, but these are 7 mountains of sociological influence. Arts and entertainment, media, business, education, politics, religion, and family. I said, look at Trump. Arts and entertainment. He had the #1 television show in America. Media. He took down 17 Republican candidates and the most heavily funded Democrat candidate in the history of our country with a Twitter account. Politics. Wow. Business. The Trump brand is world renowned. Family. His ex-wives, one's passed, but they adore him, and his kids are all successful in their own right. He's working on religion a little bit. 2 Corinthians. We'll get there. I said, Judges 14:4, Mike. What Samson's parents didn't realize is God was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. Samson was willing to do what God's people weren't. Get in the arena. Name one person who has been more of an advocate for life and religious liberty. Now, granted, he's got major issues. Don't we all? Yeah, and he's not running for pastor-in-chief. He's running for commander-in-chief, and I want him as a bodyguard for Western civilization, and I love that he has a bit of an ego. Okay, but if you got someone better out there, right now, looking at who we got, I'm like, man, can't we bring him back just for a little bit? Not that guy. My dad had Alzheimer's for 15 years. I look at Biden and my heart breaks. He just doesn't know where he is. How cruel can they be to do that? That's elder abuse. Now, I'm not joking. We put up with it. And what they've done to our sovereign border. So what I would say is, first of all, moral pietism out the window. Lincoln, in April 14th, 1865, got a bullet to the back of his head by John Wilkes Booth. He died on April 15th. And the papers listed it. And the great emancipator who lifted slavery from the warp and woof of the fabric of our country, 650,000 soldiers died on a field of battle, changed the trajectory of our nation, held the Union together, and for his efforts, he gets a bullet to the back of his head. And what do the churches in America say on April 15th? They decried the fact that he died in a theater on Good Friday. That is moral pietism. Nauseating. He did more for the nation than any pulpit in America. And all they could say was, did you see that he was in a theater on Good Friday? First of all, avoid that. And secondly, and if you can do better, then get in the arena. But I would say, focus locally. And this is the last part. My wife and I commit 10% of our income every election to candidates. I'm going to pause for emphasis because you want good candidates. How badly do you want them? It's not their campaign, it's yours. They're asking to represent you. You going to help them? And 80% of that 10% goes to local candidates. 10% goes to county. And the remaining 10% goes to state and federal. Because they're going to get PAC money and they don't need my money. And then if you come to the county level, there are some areas where I'm going to put most of it towards sheriff. But the 80% goes to local candidates. And the beautiful thing about that is it's nonpartisan. And today's dog catcher is tomorrow's Congress member. And you're creating the bench to create a better society. That's long, long answer to a very short question. Yes.
So I have a question. I guess it kind of ties into what you were talking about in trying to gather signatures on petitions and being the salt and light and engaging with our political leaders. I have run into, and it's sweet little old ladies in our church that I ask them to, would you sign this petition to stop the government from kidnapping children because parents don't want to affirm their gender, and they won't. They don't vote. They won't sign a petition. They won't do any of that. They pray. and they say, none of that does any good. I pray. And it's frustrating. How do you get through to those little sweet Christian ladies? It surprises me that they would take that position because they are some of the most godly women in the church.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, to each is given a measure of faith. And they don't have that. And they're praying for you. And you look at them and you say, I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to pray that you have a heart for the children that are being mutilated. Yes. I'm going to pray that you have a heart, that you care about them so that you won't have a millstone tied around your neck and cast in the deepest ocean. I'm going to pray that you have a care for the next generation as your parents had for you, that they would raise you in the love and the admonition of the Lord, that you got to grow up in a nation that feared God, but you are giving one to the next generation that doesn't. I would pray for you that you would plant trees of the shade you'd never know, to invest in a generation that could use your wisdom. So thank you for praying for me, and I will be praying for you for that, and then move on. And don't get upset. I can sense, because you said this earlier, you're discouraged. People aren't the enemy, they're the opportunity. And just because they're not capitulating or doing what you want them to do, you're not in charge of the outcome, you're in charge of the obedience. And what you do is unto the Lord. And he is the one who encourages you. We're not going to win every battle, but he has to be the why in what you do. It's not affirmation, it's not people agreeing with you, it's doing it because God has called you to do it. I ran for assembly, and I should have known better when I prayed about it, because Shannon Grove, the state senator, had told me in Israel when we were with Governor Rick Perry, you need to run for the assembly. I said, maybe you're hearing something from Bad Pizza. God hadn't told me that. And I prayed about it, and the Lord said, run, and he gave me a verse. And it was impression. I went and looked it up. I was excited. It was Job 13:15. Yea, though he slay me, yet will I praise him. I'm like, no. No, but I knew he wanted me to run, and I thought this is just going to be the campaign's going to be intense, but I'm competitive, I'm a swimmer, let's do this. I hate losing. And I remember the night that the returns came, and the Christians didn't turn out, and it was just abysmal. And I was just disillusioned, and I'm lamenting. And I'm like, God, Job 13:15, I get it, but I didn't think you meant I was going to lose. He says, you haven't lost. He said, I got a big plan. And I get a call from Tom Hunt. Tom has gone to be with the Lord, bless his heart. He'd had a stroke when I was a young minister, and I went to go visit him in the hospital. His face was paralyzed. And I walk up to him and he says, listen, Bob, the Lord spoke to me, and he said that you need to run for office. And when you do, I'm going to make phone calls for you if the Lord heals me. And God healed him. That man, in the 4 elections I ran in, primary, general, council, that man made over 50,000 phone calls from me. He led so many people to Christ. It was unbelievable. And I ended up winning. He called me, and he said, Rob, you need to run for the seat that your opponent vacated, the city council. I go, Tom, I'm exhausted. He goes, run. And I knew he was right, and I ran. And I remember election night, I was losing by 278 votes, and Tom goes, you're going to win by a little over 50. I go, how do you know? He goes, I made phone calls. I won by 52 votes. You know what they, wait. You know what they call the guy who wins by 52 votes? The winner. I then went on to win by thousands, and I was up for re-election, and I became mayor pro tem and mayor during the most seminal event in the 50 years of the city's history, with the shooting of the 12 in the borderline. 2 of them were from our congregation. The city was aflame with fires that encircled us in our open space. And I was there every night. I was with every parent when they were notified their child had been one of the victims. It changed the whole course of the city. God knows what he's doing. Don't get discouraged. Don't get upset with little old ladies. Count it all joy. Okay? Amen? Anyone else? Oh.
So when it comes to engaging with people about politics, a lot of us are very afraid of conflict, including myself.
Yeah.
So when it comes to those engagements, how do we plant that seed of truth without it just ending up in contention and them going, well, let's just agree to disagree and all that kind of thing?
You guys are like the dynamic duo. These are great questions. So this is one of my favorite stories. I'm glad you asked me this, because I was contemplating renting a car and driving down to the Oregon coast. because when we were younger with the kids, we went up to Crescent City and we went to Jedediah Smith campground. We couldn't afford anything, so we rented a tent trailer and slummed it. It wasn't glamping, it was like slumping or whatever you call it. And the car that I had, the brakes gave out. And I had gone to church that Sunday, and I met a guy, he's a mechanic. Bring it by, the thing's smoking, you're going to have to get that checked. I'm like, thank God. And he was, real sweet, and he knew I was a minister, and so I bring it into his shop, and I couldn't get back. He let me borrow his truck, which was, 1950-something, it was just, it was a wreck. And I went back before the campground to check on the kids and Michelle, and I go back to the shop, and he's got it up on the lift, and and I'm sitting in the waiting room, and there's a woman there. And I said, you from the area? And she says, yes. I'm originally from Modesto, but I ended up here. And I said, oh, really? What do you do for a living? And she said, well, I'm a retired teacher. So I'm calculating most teachers are a little bit liberal. Teachers union. I'm just assessing. If you ask people questions without making comment, and you want to know more about them, people want you to know about them. They don't want to know about you. And God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth to do more listening than talking. And they give you, when you listen, they give you a roadmap to their heart. And I said, oh, so you're a teacher. She says, you're retired. And I said, well, how'd you end up here? Boy, that's a long distance from Modesto to Crescent City. She said, it's a funny story. I said, I got time. She said, I opened up a map and I saw all the Indian heads of the reservations, and I thought this had to be a spiritual place, so I picked it. I go, how'd that work out? She goes, they're a bunch of drunks. She said that, I didn't. And I thought, she's struggling. And I go, you have kids? She says, I'm divorced, and my daughter's just nuts, and it's hard. And she's going through, and she started to share with her the story. And she said, what do you think about that? And I said, well, I do counseling with kids. And I gave her some advice, and she says, thank you so much. And as I listened, and there was things that I could give her without causing this tension, I was working into her realm. And she said, I just had to leave Modesto because of all those right-wing, evangelical, fundamentalist, suburban driving idiots. And I'm smiling. And by the end of the conversation, I have reached her heart, because talking about her family, the Bible says where your treasure is, your heart is also. And I figured out what was special to her, and I helped her with that. And they said, your car's ready, and she had a Geo Metro. And it was in front of my car, so the Suburban's here and hers is up on the thing, and we're watching it lower. She goes, oh, my car's ready. And she goes, I don't even know anything about you. I don't know what you do. And I said, well, I'm a right-wing evangelical fundamentalist minister. And I go, and that's my Suburban. And we laughed so hard. They're just like you and me, but they make a connection before you make it political. Because really what politics is you're sitting listening going, we want the same thing, we just don't know how to get there. But I do, but I want to hear you. And when you do, they give you a roadmap to their heart, and they allow you to lead them to the water that you're drinking. Be anxious in nothing, but in all things by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And a peace that surpasses all understanding will guard your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus. And again, James, if you lack wisdom, just ask God. He'll give you a roadmap to them. He loves them too. People aren't the enemy. They're the opportunity. The ideology that possesses them is the enemy. But you get to them by hearing them speak, and you hear their heart, and you lead them out of the darkness. And God will use you for that. Amen? Amen. All right. Do I get to go home now, Sam? Whip cracker. So at 4:30, we're going to meet with this group of people, and at 3:30, we're going to meet with this group of people, and then maybe we'll give you something to eat later, and then we're going to have a glass. Yes, Sam, yes, Sam, yes, Sam. All right, I make fun of him, but I got to tell you something. He and Charnessa, Michelle and I travel quite a bit, and there are some places that you go there and it's ministry. There's other places where you go and you're ministered to. Every time we're with Sam and Charnessa, we're ministered to. We love these two. You are so blessed. And if you treat them, mistreat them, we're stealing them. I promise you we'll steal them in a heartbeat. I mean that, Chuck. I mean that. You take good care of them. But they have blessed us. I want to say thank you to all of you for enduring the endless stories, and I'm so blessed by what you're doing in this part of the nation. You're inspiring. And again, Chuck, I think we were separated at birth. Yeah. I think maybe my dad, he was a player. All right. God bless you guys. Thanks.